It's not difficult to think of a few things if you're a South African that make you feel at home, and one of those things is undoubtedly a Spur. Now, it's become a bit of a like family joke that anyone who has kids, anytime, anywhere in South Africa, people are hungry, they got to head to the Spur. And it's become an institution, but there's a man behind it who's a fascinating human being. He's also the father of an empire that includes more than 500 franchises under the Spur, Panarottis, John Dory's, and Rockamama's brands. He's also a fascinating human being in his own right, and he's written a brilliant book which is called A Taste for Life. His name is Alan Ambor. It's so nice to see you, Alan. How are you?
Thanks. Very well. Thanks very much, Gareth. Nice to
You
see
know,
you too.
Thank you. I mean, it's an amazing thing to live in 2021 and to be able to hear the stories of entrepreneurs like yourself, because I think it's what a lot of people want to hear. A lot of people like to believe that they too have something in them that could lead to the creation of a business empire or just realizing their dreams. And for many people, their dream might just be to start a place or a restaurant or a thing or an institution or a facility or a venue where people can live and have fun and enjoy themselves. And
Yeah.
I watch, I watch with real interest when I see how much curiosity people have for these kinds of stories. And really, you've done a superb job here. I mean, I was just reading through it about a week ago and looking at your descriptions of like your car in the Karoo that time, which was a Flavia or something. You called it the Sophia Loren of
Lancia
cars.
Flavia belonged to my mate, actually, Arthur.
Okay. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just a beautiful description. So I want to get straight into it because there are a lot of people who will be really interested in your own story and then also interested in the Spurs story, which comes about as a result of your story. But tell us a little bit about the family background.
Well, my folks came from Europe, and my father got here in 1928 because the company he worked for sent him here. But my mom actually fled Hitler, and she lost a sister, and my dad lost three siblings and his parents. So
Right.
there was this underlying angst, that the world was a very dangerous place, especially if you're Jewish, which I am. And it looks like, without getting too frantic, like things are going that way again. It's amazing how things go in cycles. So
Yeah.
we had a good home life, but my parents were a product of a devastating time for their families. And that, of course, impacted upon their child.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, this is
so,
a thing. This is a thing many people talk about. Is this Holocaust guilt and the effect that that had on generations that came afterwards, and it's very real,
yeah,
and it can be devastating to people. There's built-in depression. There's a huge amount of like survivor guilt for the ones who made it through, and then for the
yeah,
ones who didn't, there's this feeling of tremendous sadness, which lasts for generations.
it does. It does. It actually permeates the consciousness. But I'm very fortunate that my parents were very upbeat, positive people in the main. They didn't sit around feeling sorry for themselves. They had an attitude that they put onto me. They didn't inflict it, they imbued me. That's the better word.
Right.
And as a result of that, because they were both very hardworking, both very dedicated to what they did, I had a good upbringing. I wasn't spoilt. We didn't have money throwing around. We worked for everything that we got, and I was taught that if you want something, you got to go out there and earn it. You can't expect somebody, some fairy godfather or mother, to wave a wand and make it happen for you. If you want it, you got to make it happen.
Now
And
you're
that's what
you're
happened.
very I mean, your very humble beginnings, you certainly were not, and you have never been in your life, to my understanding, a boring kind of stick in the mud business kind of guy, one of those cookie cutter accountant types. I mean, no, you're not. I mean, have you still got your ponytail? You're like a surfer. You're a bit of a yeah. There we are. You're an anomaly.
Yeah,
You're a bit of a weirdo. I love people like that. You've got real
yeah, I am
character and
a bit of.
personality, and you've had that for all the time that you've been in business, and even before must have been when you were a child that this personality was built. So how did it all tell us about that night in the Karoo, because that's kind of where the story begins, and it's a beautiful way to paint the picture for everybody.
Yeah, it was incredible. The year before, we'd come to Cape Town on holiday, Arthur and I, and this time he'd brought his fiancée with him, who he'd met in the interim. And the first year we slept in Beaufort West for 3 hours before he decided we were going on, but he'd rested. This time he decided, no, to hell with that. We are going through the night straight to Cape Town. And it was incredible. We were on this very straight stretch of road, 1 a.m, sky was dark, no moon, lots of stars. I was in the back seat of a 2-door, big Italian galleon, I think is how I described it. And we were pelting down the road. And it's incredible how I instantly realized that Arthur had fallen asleep, but I didn't believe it because the car was solid. It was going. It wasn't veering off the road. He hadn't slumped forward. But after about, I don't know, 20 seconds, it appeared we were heading for a rock face because the road now the straight road got a turn to the left and the road had been cut into a kopje. And we were heading for this rock face. So I said, Arthur, are you awake? And he woke up with a start and he turned the wheel and we missed the rock face, but we went across the road over the other side and we tumbled nose over tail 3 or 4 times down a steep shale slope until we came to rest with the nose facing in the direction we'd come from. I don't know how that happened. Arthur wasn't in the car. His door was open. His fiancée, Mina, was saying, oh my goodness, only she didn't use the word goodness. I got out. I saw Arthur lying there. He was out. He was unconscious. I pulled Mina out because I smelled petrol and took her to the side. And then I said to her, I'm going up because there was a car behind us. This was 1:15 in the morning. And I was going to try and stop them. I tried to stop them after quite a long climb, and they drove right past me. If I hadn't got out the way, they would have run me over. But fortunately, the guy who was on duty at the station that night and was asleep heard the noise, heard the commotion. We were about 5 k's away, and he came out in his truck, and I could hear the gears grinding up the hill because we were going down into the valley where Lanesburg's situated. And eventually he saw me and he took Arthur into town and they got an ambulance and we all went through to Cape Town. So that's how the book starts. And it's a fantastic, quite exciting story, actually, and quite a sobering event, to put it bluntly.
Yeah, that's a hell of a start. Now, when something like that happens in most people's lives, they tend to have this kind of epiphany afterwards. They're like, I've been wasting my life. Life is so precious. Life is so short. I want to do something with my life. I mean, did you have any of that immediately, or did it take you a while to decide, no, this is you've got more direction now?
Well, no, I didn't actually. But what did happen was he had a little truck with a front seat. So Mina and Arthur got laid on the front seat, Mina sitting in the corner with his head on her lap, and they went into town and the guy came back and fetched me. I had this misguided feeling that I had to look after our possessions. So and I also needed some time to myself because I was shocked. I sat on this whitewashed rock and I waited, and all of a sudden in the bowels of the car, a tape recorder clicked on and the Beatles started singing, Michel, ma belle, sont des mondes qui vont très bien ensemble. And of course I burst into tears thinking of my parents and my girlfriend who was waiting for me in Cape Town. And so I didn't have that sort of epiphany, but there was a reaction to the shock of that terrible crash. And as the car went over the edge, Gareth, I thought, this is it, I'm going to die. And I was incredibly calm. It was very weird.
Yeah, that's a strange thing. I mean, I've been in a car accident too, and you smell and taste and hear and see everything in extraordinary detail, but you kind of think, oh, well, if this is it, then I suppose that's it. You are calm. You're not screaming. Like, they always show
nothing you can do about it.
No, there's nothing. So,
Yeah.
I want to fast forward a little bit because I mean, it's not as if your life in Cape Town was straight from school into successful business either. I mean, you had some real adventures in your life and continue to have, obviously.
Yeah. And the question is, sorry.
No, no, no. Tell us about some of these adventures you got up to long before you became the guy behind Spur and you opened up that first restaurant in Cape Town.
Well, I didn't know what I was going to do when I left school. I had no clue. And my dad was selling carpets and upholstery materials, and smoking pipes. Pipes were very
Right.
popular in those days. This is the 50s, 40s. And we were now in the late 50s, like 58 when I finished school. Didn't know what I was going to do. And the one sales manager who came out often from the carpet company invited me to England to train in the business, bearing in mind that he probably thought that this youngster who he thought might be hardworking and bright, that he would end up running the business and working with them in the future. So I went to England on the second voyage on Easter Monday of the Pendennis Castle from Cape Town to London, to Southampton on the train to London. And I got on a motorbike in June of that year. I went in April and rode around Europe and had a couple of adventures, going to various youth hostels and just being on my own and driving around Europe, which was an incredible treat.
But Alan, I mean, these are things that to most of us who are much younger, we can't even imagine, getting on a ship and sailing for weeks, if not months, to get to England, and
10
then
days.
have it's a long time. I mean, that's not what we're used to now. I mean, these days you hop on a flight and you could be there in like 12 hours.
Correct.
The fact that you could then hop on a bike and ride through Europe it just sounds like a bygone era in some ways. It must have been very exciting.
Unfortunately, I can vouch for that.
And it was probably the most exciting formative time of your life. I mean, you meet different people, you see different things. Are there any of your memories of that time that you think you carried into your business career?
Well, I think one of the great things my parents gave me was this work ethic, as I keep saying. And the company in England also, they were very kind to me. They got me attached to one of their reps who used to ride around England selling their products in the south and the center of England. And he was a very proud Englishman, a dapper chap who had a Morris shooting brake, with the wood on the outside and a big boot to carry the samples. And he'd go out of my way. He was very proud of England. And he'd go out of his way to show me England. He took me to places in Devon called Watersmeet, where two rivers met, Cheddar Gorge. He took me to York Minster, the big cathedral, and all over England. He was so proud. And I was influenced. My dad, in any case, was an Anglophile coming from the Second World War and Churchill having defeated Hitler. And generally, I was spoilt, but I worked for my keep, as it were. So that was a great adventure, learning from those guys. And the sales manager who invited me over, who was a great mate of my dad's, they used to enjoy a whiskey together. And he came out to South Africa quite often because that increased sales. The mere fact that he was there, people were willing to meet with him and go out for lunches, etc. And when I got to England, I was a talking point. I was this young 18-year-old from South Africa who was coming to train, so they took me with them for lunch. And I remember the first lunchtime I was in London, I had a gin and tonic, which I'd never had before, and at lunchtime, there I was, a little bit the worse for wear,
I mean, you talk about how you narrowly missed another accident in France, it must have been. And there are all kinds of things that happened to you along the way, which, I mean, these are the lessons of youth and the time where you're meant to have fun. Was there ever any pressure on yourself from your parents or from the family to kind of get on with it and get a proper job? And I mean, you were earning your keep, as you rightly explained, but to actually decide on a career, because parents in those days thought if you didn't get on with it and choose a career, you were a layabout and you were wasting money and time. And what are you doing? Get yourself together.
Now, my parents knew I worked hard because from the age of 15, I already worked in a delicatessen on weekends. And then I put myself through university because my dad moaned at me I wasn't working hard enough. So I said, okay, Dad, I've got this job in a steakhouse. I'll pay you back. And that's what I did. I paid him back for all of my first year fees. And I carried on paying for myself working in the steakhouse. And thank goodness for that, because I had two real dead end, boring, soul destroying jobs thereafter. I mean, look at you, Gareth. Look at the job you've got. You have such fun. You meet so many interesting people. You get into all sorts of scrapes, and it's wonderful. I take my hat off to you, you know. And
well,
I wanted a life like that.
Look, it has its risks, but then so did you. Let's just go back to the original Golden Spur, which was in
Yeah,
Newlands in Cape Town.
yeah.
And in your book, first of all, you print a picture of the menu, which is just unbelievable, because a filet mignon, which was the most expensive item, was R1.50. I mean, these
Yes.
days, if you go into even a Spur, if you go in with a R1.50, they'll chase you out and say, "I'm sorry, there's nothing we have here for you that you can afford."
A rand
But in those
50
days,
is a tip.
that was a lot of money in those days, though.
Yes. It was the equivalent of $250 today. That's how sad capitalism is. That's the one area where it fails because it erodes your value. So if you don't invest your money carefully, you end up when you're older with very little. And if you haven't got kids to look after you, I mean, it's a sad time. You know you're on your way out, and you know that you can't really enjoy yourself whilst you're going through the exit door. That's a bit of a problem.
But I want to talk about this Golden Spur because it wasn't your restaurant from the beginning, and you saw this place. And you opened the first one, because I was under the impression that in the book there was a restaurant there already.
No, there wasn't. Can I clarify?
Yeah, please.
I worked for a fella in Johannesburg who worked with his uncle and his cousin, and the uncle had opened a business with a partner called the Golden Spur in Rosebank in Johannesburg. And he then sold it to another man who'd run it into the ground, and it had become, by the time I started getting involved, it had become defunct. And so one day when I was in Cape Town riding around looking for premises, I saw a place called a Black Steer, which was their second one in Johannesburg. He cribbed the name because they hadn't registered the name. So I thought, well, if I ever open in Cape Town, I can't use the name Steer. It was Black Steer. I have to use Golden Spur. And that name was actually owned by a company that may or may not exist. They sold coffee house and Five Roses tea called Glenton and Mitchell. And they wrote me a lawyer's letter saying, you're using our name, but we'll sell it to you for R100, which was big money in those days. And I bought the name and I owned the name. So I couldn't use the name Steer, and I had to use the name Spur, which was a good thing in the final analysis because these guys couldn't really franchise. They had a few steakhouses in Joburg, a couple were franchised. But when they went to Cape Town or to Brakpan or to somewhere else, they didn't understand the concept of franchising, even though they were trying to franchise. And they let me down. 9 people were meant to come and help me open my business, and not one arrived, even though we begged them and phoned them and cajoled them, and we'd signed a contract. And eventually we parted company. And because the old man, George Halamandra Sr., had mentored me and been so helpful in many ways to me, I made another deal with him when I started my own franchise company after my partner and I split up because he was a bit of a lazy chap.
And so, this is the late 60s, right?
This is the late 60s, early 70s now.
Now, yes. What was the market like at that time, and what was South Africa like? Because you had to be brave to do anything like open a restaurant. But to open a restaurant, in Cape Town, and to know what's going on in that market, you have to be pretty sharp, and your margins are thin. They always have been in restauranting, right? In hospitality of any kind, you've got very very thin margins, and people aren't going to pay more than X for something, and they're not going to pay less than this because then they're worried the quality's poor. So you really have to know your business.
Well, Gareth, tell you the truth. I battled for 4 years before I could open my business. How I stuck to it and was so stubborn as to keep going, goodness knows, but I'm so grateful that I was. That's number one. Number two, there were very few restaurants, so demand was higher than supply. And number three, we were very profitable from the beginning because we did big turnover. So once you've paid your rent and your electricity, your marginal costs are nominal. The cost of your food is all you're paying for. And you've left your rent and your big overheads behind. Now you start making really good profits if you're making really good turnover. And the way we ran the business was to encourage people to eat it and beat it, is how some people expressed it, but they loved the energy. They loved the speed of service. They loved the way we looked after them. They loved the way that nothing was too much trouble, because my attitude was there's only one person who's important, and that's the customer. And I had a mantra, and the mantra was, it doesn't matter who suffers as long as it's not the business. And I suffered plenty. I worked ridiculous hours because we had nobody to help us open the business. And as long as the customer didn't suffer, he'd come back. And if he came back, we built up a rapport, and they got to know us who ran the business. And it was a great feeling building this business. It was so rewarding. It was so fulfilling. And it wasn't the money. I've never been a breadhead. I really haven't. I don't know much about that side of the business, but I knew about the creative side. I knew about looking after people because it was my natural instinct.
So there are a couple of things from that story that you've just told now that got me thinking. The first one is how you really have to work hard. No matter who you are, luck will only take you so far. And hard work means the long hours you mentioned. It means having to manage other people. It means having to look after sometimes very difficult customers. There are a lot of people who are growing up today, and they look at entrepreneurial stories, but they don't really pay attention to how much of that hard work plays a role. And I'll come to the other stuff in a minute, like the creativity and the energy. But sometimes when you're in it, Alan, and there are many people who may be listening to you now thinking, God, I wish I could be as successful one day as you are. When you're in it, though, you don't realize that you're building a success. You're just kind of at the grindstone, right? You're not necessarily thinking about 10 years' time or franchisees or any of the stuff you dealt with much later on. You're just trying to get the day done and do as good a job as you can.
Yes, you got it in a nutshell there, Gareth. You understand fully. And the fact that I started franchising only came about because a mate of mine who I was at school with walked in one Saturday night in December, and I went up to him and welcomed him. How are you, Raymond? He said, fine. I said, you down on holiday? He said, no, coming to live here. Oh, I said, and he was an accountant. I said, what are you going to do? He says, I want to open a steakhouse. I said, where? He said, in Belleville. I said, funny. The Old Mutual have contacted me. They have premises, which are still trading today, in Belleville, and they want me to open a steakhouse there. He says, well, will you help me? I said, sure, man, I'll franchise you, because I understood what franchising was, because they let me down so badly. I knew what it took to open the business, the guys who were meant to franchise me. And he was my first franchisee, and he was very successful. He was a bit of a slow starter in Belleville, but after 2.5 months, boy, they took off, and they're still there, and they're still motoring. So one can be proud of that. And I trained him very well, and I trained all his staff. And that's one of the crucial things in our business, training to your own standards. Don't let your staff set your standards. You've got to be alert all the time. You've got to tell them, you do it like this, you don't do it like that. And then you've got to correct them again, etc., etc. Vigilance.
And Alan, obviously, I mean, one of the side stories in your book is the story of some of the staff who you've been friends with, and many of them are like family to you and have been for upwards of 30, 40 years, which is an
50
incredible part of the
years.
story. Yeah,
50
there we
years.
go. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad you raised that, because where I was blessed, and at the time didn't quite realize it, but it soon hit me, was that the first staff that I hired, and maybe fired a few because they were not suitable for whatever reason, I was blessed to have people who loved working hard, who were talented. I had a griller who's unfortunately no longer on the planet, in his spirit is, by the name of Shadrach Yezer, who was such a wonderful guy and so talented. And he loved the challenge of handling 7 waiters, each of them with 4 or 5 orders simultaneously on the grill, not all of them coming off at the same time, because some guys were into dessert, some guys were into hors d'oeuvres. But guys like him. And I had women who I trained to make our special sauces and juices, which a friend of my mom set up with my first wife. And really, these people were loyal, and they were competent, and they were reliable, and without them, I would have died. I would have drowned.
Well, you mentioned the training, and you kept your staff happy. I mean, you also looked after them as much as you trained them and expected the best from them. I would say one word that comes to mind, even today, when I order from Spur, which I'll have you know I still do, is consistency. No, consistency. You have managed, and I think it's just sheer force of will on your part, managed to get a consistent product. I mean, it doesn't matter. You know what a Spur steak tastes like. It's just, and I know when I think about it, I get hungry. There's something about that must have started with you back in like 67.
Yeah. Well, to be honest, the people I worked for when I put myself through university, who were meant to franchise me, taught me a lot of that. But they didn't go out of their way to teach me. I was allowed to work there, and I picked up on it, but they did teach me. So I got quite a few of the fundamentals from them, but you used the phrase force of will. And that's very true. And quite a few people actually didn't particularly care for my force of will, because I was perceived as a demanding bugger, which I was, because I was looking after the business and the customer.
I think Spur sometimes gets a bit of a bad rap from people who think that they're culinary experts. They imagine that somehow the French cuisine that they're cooking up for their husband, which no one else will taste or judge them on, they somehow think that that's superior in some way to the family steakhouse model that you guys built. I mean, I disagree completely, and I know nothing about food, but I do know what good food tastes like. I mean, I can't cook anything. I can do a reasonable steak, but I can't do very much else. So what do you think it is that made Spur take off the way that it did, aside from the things you've already mentioned, because those are all obviously valuable and true, the consistency, the training, making sure that you looked after the customers. But there's something about the brand, and that's where you bring in your creativity too. There's something about that made South Africans go, that's where we'll go for supper tonight.
Well, I think there's the decor, which is nice to be surrounded by. But the most important thing, in my opinion, is the generosity. You've got the salad dressing, which everybody loves, and French fry dressing, the white sauce, the creamy sauce, and the barbecue sauce on the table. Then you've got the special basting that we put on the steaks and burgers, and another basting for the chicken, and a special seasoning salt on the chips. These are patent recipes that we have exclusively, and they're very important. And the mere fact that you can sit down and help yourself to as much barbecue sauce as you like, you don't have to ask and pay for another portion, because you don't pay for them. They are on the table. That's generosity. In the old days, if a guy had gone halfway through his steak and had no more chips and onions, I'd rush off to the grill with a little side plate, fill it with a nibble portion of chips and onions, go up to him, slide it onto his plate and say, "Sir, I can see you need some chips and onions." And he'd say, no, I don't want it. And I'd say, "If you don't want them, please leave them, and I promise you they ate them." And that's generosity. That's looking after people. That's, I'll tell you another story very quickly, and that on rainy days, sometimes we had we always had queues, but sometimes people didn't want to wait in the queue in the outside blustery wind of Cape Town, and they'd go to their car. I'd run across the road, knock on the window, and they'd wind it down and say, "Sir, madam, sorry to intrude like this, but by the time you go somewhere else, find parking, get soaking wet in the rain, I'll have you in bed after having had a lovely meal. Won't you just wait 5 minutes, please?" And they'd come back with me more likely than not. And I would look after them and give them special attention personally to make sure they were happy. And they'd come back because I knew, especially in the early days of the business, if I looked after people, I had a chance they'd come back. If I didn't get them to sit down and eat, I might never see them again. And that's what I was scared of.
You mentioned the decor just a second ago, and I mean, here's the famous Indian chief on the cover of your book. But I mean, that must have been a bit of an inspired choice. How did that come about? Because a lot of the stuff that we see now as branding is, it's ad agencies, and it's kind of made up by a bunch of people who sit in a room and how did this come about? I somehow feel like there might be a bit more legend to it than anything else.
Well, Gareth, to be fair, if any of the ad agencies I've worked with, or most of them anyway, are listening, I must say I worked with some fantastic people because I did that creative side of the business. So the first logo that Spur had was this wheel on a cowboy boot that the cowboy digs into the flanks of the horse to make him go faster, and it's cruel. And in the early 80s, I had a sense that South Africa was changing and that I had to give a signal to people of color that they were welcome in Spur, that we didn't want to be excluding anybody, which has always been mine, and it was taught me by my parents, that everybody's a human being and everybody should be welcome. So I came up with the Red Indian. I had a mate of mine who used to do a different logo for all our stores, because all our stores, even though they Spur Steak Ranch, Golden had a little bag with nuggets, Seven had a big Seven, Apache had an Indian, and so on and so forth. So I got somebody. I just bought a building for our offices, and it was on Eastern Boulevard in Cape Town, very, very well exposed building. And I got a guy to design a frontage for the building with that Red Indian in it. And he gave me an old man, and it hangs in my office now. I said to him, no, Spur is a virile young brand. I want that Red Indian to be exactly that. So he redesigned him, and you've shown him to everybody on the cover of the book. And that became our logo. And now I'm hearing in the press that the new people running Spur, I've been out for 2.75 years now, the new people are thinking of dropping the Red Indian. And I think that would be a shame, because you don't want to be confused with other sort of similar-ish sort of brands. And over time, if you don't have that distinguishing feature, I think you'll lose business, you'll lose credibility, you'll lose exposure. But they tell me, some people, no, the world's moved on. I don't agree, but who am I to say?
Well, I mean, the Americans are renaming football teams and all kinds of things because it's now politically incorrect. But what's so funny is that for the average person, and it's always these, this tiny minority of very politically correct people who seem to have way too much say in things. But I think the average South African, if we didn't see this, I don't think that we would know we were at Spur, to be perfectly frank. And it's such a hugely successful business. I hope they don't make that mistake and throw away legacy and all that value that's been built up over years, and loyalty, frankly.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that.
But
because I think it's very valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know better than anyone else. But, Alan, you're not just a guy who started off a business or all this other stuff. You're also like a bit of a performer. Like, you were in the theater, and I want you to talk about that for a little bit, because you do on your book's cover say that a steakhouse is a theater of the senses. And I think this is probably related to you and your story as much as it is a true thing to say. I mean, you used to get dressed up and perform for people. This was something else that you absolutely loved doing. Tell us how that all started.
Well, when I was at school, they used to have a dramatic society, so I was in a couple of plays. When I was at university, I was in a couple of plays directed by a very, very bright young student by the name of Joseph Sherman, who was an amazing director. And we did well. We got good crits from the Stars critic in those days, Oliver Walker, who my dad respected. So that made
Yeah.
me feel. And then when I started exiting the retail night trade and running more the growth of the franchise, the Space Theatre in Cape Town, which was an anti-apartheid theatre run by Brian Asprey and Yvonne Bryceland, who eventually ended up in England, and Brian is still there. They produced plays, and I had a friend called Percy Seif, who was on radio in the old days and was an actor, and he got me into the space. And I was in a few plays for them, and then I got invited to take a part in Long Day's Journey into Night by Eugene O'Neill. And when I told my wife I wanted to do this, she said, look, if you do this, you've been in the steakhouse for years, now you want to be working nights in the theatre. If you do this, I'm going to leave you. And so I didn't take that part. I left the theatre, and eventually, I'm afraid to say, she left me anyway. So I should have carried on in the theatre because I found it terribly fulfilling. But unfortunately, or fortunately, because we had a good marriage for a long time, and we had 2 children, and who I'm very proud of today. And I've got a third one as well, a youngster of 27, who I'm equally proud of. Yeah, that's how life goes. So I did have the ability, the talent to act, provided I had a good director to show me the way, and most directors did. So there you go. I did have that part of life as well.
You mentioned your children, and I mean, Spur was your eldest child, whether you like it or not. You even say so in the book, right? So how did your kids? I mean, yeah, they must have grown up kind of in the restaurant, right? So they must have figured out that this was where they had to be because Dad was working really hard, and if you weren't part of that family business, no.
No, look, they used to come to the Spur for meals, but by the time they were big enough to be in the outside world and go out for a burger, I'd be the one who took them with their mom. And I was already now no longer working full days and nights, and I wasn't in retail anymore. I was now in growing the franchise, working more like 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. rather than 8 a.m. till 2 a.m., which is what retail demanded in the main. So they didn't grow up in the store like some restaurateurs' families do. Their mother kept them at home, school, home, and then on weekends they'd go to the Spur. Yes, absolutely.
But I mean, they obviously, you know, there are nice pictures in the book too of you and your family going to Mauritius to celebrate a family occasion, and obviously, you know, there's something about this Spur giving back to you guys and giving back a bit of time. You've always been very keen on yoga. Tell me about what that means to you. You practice yoga every day, right?
Yeah, I practice it 6 days a week. I have 1 day's rest. I'm teaching on Zoom 5 days a week. It's 22 classes a month. For 300 Rand, all the money goes to Ladles of Love charity, feeding the poor in the Cape Flats, which is an organization built up by this amazing man, Danny de Liberto. I don't know if you've heard of him. And I've got a group of pupils who are very loyal. And I must say, Iyengar yoga has been my savior because it's kept me fit, strong, and healthy. And you can't ask for more than that. You know, I don't get sick. I am very fit. I walk the mountain, and I love yoga. It's very good for you, and it's very satisfying mentally and physically. And I've been doing it for 53 years.
It's incredible, and I've having met you in person, I know how much vitality and energy you have. So, I mean, with all of this incredible stuff that you put in the book, and there's obviously a little bit of the controversy of kind of what happened at the Texaco Spur and that stuff that went on social media and how you guys had to deal with that. There's also
Yeah.
stories about your parents and their lives, and so much color and information here about a really incredible life. But you're not finished yet. I mean, you're still a busy man. You have a lot going on at the moment, and it's not likely to stop, is it? You've got a huge amount of energy.
Well, I have got a lot of energy, and I think that also comes from yoga. And as far as having the energy and my life's not over, that's most certainly, I hope, the truth, factual. And I just want to say, if I may, I hope you don't mind, that I'm looking to lecture to people. I'm looking for
Hmm.
consultation work because now that the
Sure.
book's written and the interviews are mostly done, I do have quite a lot of spare time. And I'm keen to get involved if it's for non-profit organizations, to do some work for them, to give back. I'm already giving back by teaching yoga and all the money going to a charity. And I've got lots of time to do more. So if there's anybody out there who's looking for a youngster like myself to help them grow or develop or improve or use some of my knowledge to help them, here I am. Give me a
Wow,
shout.
it's not often that you get an offer like that from someone who's as accomplished as you are. So I'm sure that there will be many ways that people will be trying to contact you in the next few weeks. Alan, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. Well done on the book, and
Thank you.
congratulations on your incredible success. The fact that you continue to inspire so many of us, and I hope that we'll see you again in our studio soon.
Thanks, Gareth. Thank you so much for making the time to talk to me. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I always enjoy myself. And that's what you want from life. You want to do something that you enjoy. You don't want to do something that grinds you into the dust. So thank
Damn
you.
right. Those are wise words. Thank you so much, Alan Ambor, everybody.